Question: on the topic of discerning who among ordinary people might be a fallen being, is it sufficient to apply Jesus' teaching from the Bible regarding false prophets, that by their fruits ye shall know them? I have several videos I talk about fallen beings. If you're new to the concept, watch my video on how the world was created. It goes into depth about it. Question goes on: I struggle to see the practicality of sorting through people short of them behaving as fallen beings, particularly when there seems to be an upward trend of fallen beings even ascending. While I feel it is good that we are more conscious of narcissism as a society, the term can be overused, and I think there might be a danger of similarly profiling people in spiritual communities without much, if any, practical reason to do this. Yeah, and that's a very good point to bring up. I have talked a little bit about that in a couple of videos about fallen beings, because the ego can use any idea to judge others. One of the things the ego does is judge others. And whatever idea you give, it can be misused by the ego. And I have personally known people who got themselves, they took the concept of fallen beings and they got themselves into this state of mind where anybody who disagreed with them was a fallen being. And therefore they would treat them with, disdain or disrespect or whatever. And of course that's unhealthy. It basically becomes a sort of what they call spiritual bypassing, where if you have problems with other people, you don't need to look at yourself. It's their problem because they're fallen beings. So the ego is always looking for excuses to project that the problem is outside yourself. But for me, and many people I know, the concept of fallen beings was hugely important. And there's several reasons for it. One is that I realized I'm an avatar, and I talk in my avatar videos, I talk a lot about fallen beings, that the dynamic between avatars and fallen beings. And it was very, very important for me to come to realize this. The other reason it was important for me is that, well, it's again because I'm an avatar, I had this idea I should be able to help all people. And so if I met somebody that I couldn't help, I thought it was because I wasn't good enough. And so I had to try and find a way to persuade them or make them see what they couldn't see. And so realizing that there's something called fallen beings that I simply can't help, that was a great relief to me, because instead of feeling that I'm inadequate and I need to twist myself into a pretzel to help these people, I could just say, okay, I can only be who I am. And if that doesn't help them, then it's not my responsibility. And so that was important for me, to just give up this idea of having to help everybody. Because there are some people, it's okay to just to let them go, just to surrender and say, I can't help this person, and I don't want to spend my time and attention and energy on trying to help a person I can't help. That is a legitimate decision to make. Now, when we talk about fallen beings, it's easy to talk about the more extreme ones. The ones who are dictators, mass murderers, this or that. The most selfish, insensitive people. And that's also why this concept of narcissism is important. I mean, it's important to consider if you have had narcissists in your relationships. But of course, again, there are fallen beings. I've explained in several videos, there are different levels of fallen beings, or rankings of fallen beings. Some are the more extremely selfish, and others just followed the leaders when they fell. And many of these people are embodied among us, and they have a tendency to find spiritual movements and join spiritual movements. So in many spiritual movements, you are going to meet a certain group of people, certain percentage of people that are fallen beings. But they're not the extremely selfish ones. And, the way I look at this is that even though I know about the concept of fallen beings, have known about it for many years, when I meet people personally, I don't go around judging whether they're fallen beings or not. I don't think that way. No. I don't judge people. I don't evaluate people. I just meet people the way they are. I'm striving to be myself and interact with them, see if I can help them in any way. But I don't go around with this evaluation of it. Because it is important to identify that there are certain people who are so evil that they are beyond the normal human beings. But it's not important to go around and evaluate those that are not so selfish. And it's certainly not important for us to decide whether somebody else has a chance of making it on the path. You see, when I said earlier, I didn't say that I'm judging, oh, this person has no chance to make it on the path. I'm just simply evaluating, can I help that person? And if I can't, then I have a right to say I won't spend my time on it. And that's the right we have, irregardless of they're fallen beings or not. So I don't go around evaluating people based on this. I don't go around looking for fallen beings behind every person that disagrees with me. And so I think the questioner is right. I mean, we do need to cut each other some slack, and not go around evaluating this. But it's also true, as the person is saying, that referring to Jesus' statement, "By their fruits ye shall know them," and that's obviously when they are extremely selfish and self-centered. And you can find people on the spiritual path who claim to be very spiritual and they seem to be doing all the outer things right, but they are totally focused on themselves. And I have met some of those over the years. I don't necessarily call them fallen beings, but there comes a point where you realize you can't help somebody who's so focused on themselves because they're just taking. They're always taking. And I don't mind giving to somebody else if it helps them transcend themselves, if it helps them grow. But when you give and give and give and you see that person is not growing, you're just taking what you're giving them and staying in the same state of consciousness, focused on themselves, then you come to a point where you're saying, am I just feeding my energies into a black hole here? There's no chance of ever filling it up. So that's one thing. There can be the outer actions, but most people you meet in spiritual movements are not so openly selfish. I have met some that try to cheat other people out of their money, for example, with dubious investment schemes or multi-level marketing or whatever. But most people, it's not really their actions you can tell, but you can more tell on their focus on themselves and they're taking instead of giving, and they are not transcending themselves. It's almost like, I remember especially one person that I knew for a long time, and I came to the realization that even though this person had attempted to heal her psychology in many ways, there was still a core of her psychology that she hadn't even started to look at because she wasn't willing to look at it. And that's when I sort of started pulling back and saying, what am I doing here? And but anyway, so the other thing I will say is that as you're walking the path, and I've talked about this in many videos, you're overcoming some of these subconscious selves based on duality. And when you stop thinking dualistically, you attain what I would call discernment, higher discernment or Christ discernment, where you're not having a standard in your outer mind that you're using to evaluate. You're not analyzing everything, but you are becoming more intuitive and without any judgment. In other words, you go into a neutral state of mind. And when you become neutral, you can read vibration. You can simply read energies. You can read people's energy. And this is not something you are deliberately doing with your outer mind. You're not going around deliberately trying to read people's energies, but it can happen that sometimes you're meeting a person, perhaps immediately, as the first impression, or perhaps after some time, you get this impression, this person isn't growing, this person is not willing to grow. That can be a sign that it's a fallen being, that they're just basically putting on a facade of being spiritual, but they're not really spiritual. And of course, if you get that, and if you know it's intuition, it's not the outer mind, then that's another way to evaluate people. But as I'm saying, you're not deliberately going around evaluating people. So what I'm saying is, it was important, and I think it's important for all spiritual people to realize there are some beings that are really different from most human beings. They are so stuck in this selfishness and seeing themselves as separate beings that are superior to all others that you can't help them. You can't change them. You can't transform them. Partly because, as I've said in some videos, they see themselves as fundamentally superior to you. They won't listen to anything you say. So it's important to realize that, partly because it explains these examples from world history of these very infamous dictators that killed millions of people or created a war that killed millions of people. So it's important to know that. But beyond that, I'm not going around evaluating other people. And I'm not thinking in terms of fallen beings. What I try to do is, I'm just sort of letting it happen, but to understand the fallen psychology, to understand the duality consciousness, how that plays itself, because this has been more important for me than evaluating is this person a fallen being or not. To come to understand how the duality consciousness works, how subtle it is, and how it has this ability, you might call it serpentine logic, to turn things around and suddenly accuse you of having done something wrong. And as I said, the ego can turn anything, but the duality consciousness, the serpentine logic, can also turn anything around. And it can also take the idea of fallen beings and turn around and say, oh, you shouldn't be judging me. You're judging, that's not spiritual. You shouldn't be judging anybody. So therefore, you should just let me be who I am and continue to give to me, because that's how you're being a spiritual person. So you see what I'm saying? It's important to understand this very, very subtle logic of the fallen mindset, which is always refusing to look at itself and projecting at you that you are the problem. So, instead of evaluating people, just try to grasp that, the fallen consciousness, the serpentine consciousness, the dualistic consciousness, how it works, and how subtle it is, and how it can turn things around. Even your own ego can use this against you. And that is, has been hugely important for me to come to see this in greater and greater depth. I'm not saying I've fully seen it, but I certainly see a lot more than I did years ago of how this duality consciousness can turn everything around. And it's always pointing outside itself, outside yourself. And you need to be, it can be helpful to see it in other people, but really the important thing is to see it in yourself, to see whether you have a subconscious self that's based on this. So you're always projecting out instead of looking at the beam in your own eye. I mean, in a sense, you could say that one of the most important benefits of knowing about fallen beings is to realize how the fallen consciousness works, so we can see that we may still have some subconscious selves that are based on this serpentine logic, so we can free ourselves from them, because they are what's really detrimental on the path. They are really what keeps us from growing. So it's very important to come to see that. But the questioner makes an important point, that anything can be misused by the ego, and we need to find that balance. It's again one of those things where, in its most primitive form, the duality consciousness always looks at the two extremes. So it will say, you shouldn't be even thinking about fallen beings because you shouldn't judge other people. But that's not what I call discernment. Discernment is the middle way. It goes beyond the extremes. And therefore it says, no, we shouldn't judge other people, but we should know that there are certain beings that are in a certain state of consciousness. We should know there's something called the fallen consciousness, the dualistic state of consciousness, the serpentine logic. We need to know this. It's this idea again of Jesus said it, be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. We are harmless as doves when we don't judge other people, don't use it to discriminate them and put them down. But if we are only harmless as doves, we are being naive. So we have to attain that discernment that allows us to be wise as serpents, wise to the serpents and how they're trying to manipulate us. Because otherwise, if we are only harmless as doves, we will be taken advantage of by these very self-centered people.